Sometimes I don't think you have time not to do it. I think everybody's heard the sort of slow down, the speed up kind of thing. If you really slow down and figure out what went wrong with this, what can we miss, it may help you to accelerate in the future.
Expanding possibilities, the mindset zone.
I'm your host, Anna Melikian. I'm here to support you, increase your impact while preventing burnout. The Mindset Zone is a place to pause, increase your self-awareness, and embrace the experimentation mindset. Find more resources, including information about the Mindset Zone book and audiobook at mindset.zone. Yes, instead of .com is .zone. Today, our special guest is Ron Higgs, a former naval aviator who is now a leadership consultant. And Ron brings his cockpit-tested clarity to the chaos of modern leadership. And in this conversation, we will be unpacking how the mindset of a naval aviator applies to today ever-changing business landscape, from embracing feedback to aligning teams under pressure. And whether you are navigating the artificial intelligence, the AI disruption, or daily team dynamics, this episode offers actionable insights to help you navigate and communicate your way forward. Welcome to the Mindset Zone, Ron.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking so forward to our conversation here today.
Me too, because you have this impressive background as a former naval aviator. And I'm very curious for you to share with us a bit about, first of all, how you transition from the military to the corporate world and now consulting, and how has that journey influenced how you do it?
That was a long road, so I'll try to make this as short as I can. So I went to the Naval Academy. I went to flight school. I spent a total of 24 years in the Navy, mostly in aerospace and defense. I worked on satellites as well. But in the Navy, in addition to flying, I did something what's called an aerospace engineering duty officer. So I worked with corporate America, defense contractors on programs related to naval aviation. So aircraft systems, aircraft weapon and sensor systems, and satellite systems. From that, when it was time for me to get out of the Navy, a natural extension of that was to go and work for defense contractors and do similar work as a liaison to the Navy and just aircraft in general, maybe not all of that. So I did a few different things. I did sales and business development for a defense contractor. I worked on a systems engineering team for the Boeing 787.
Wow.
I worked in Boeing as a member of the flight operations group, where I got to fly some airplanes on their first flights out of the factory to make sure that they were ready to deliver to the customer. From that, I took a leadership role in getting those aircraft delivered to the US military. Lots of different stuff. So when I decided that I really wanted to go and do something different, the first thing I did was searched for traits, characteristics, skill sets that were transferable outside of the aerospace and defense community. And I looked at what was common in my entire career, and it was leadership. I was educated based on the tenets of leadership. The U.S. Naval Academy, it's been around since 1845, with leadership as its primary mission. And so that was ingrained into my DNA since I was 17 years old. And I've led technical teams throughout. So when it was time for me to go off on my own, I got involved in a few startups, but leadership really was the thing. So I had to figure out, how am I going to use my expertise in leadership to do the things that I like and to make the impact that I want to make. And that's how I've sort of arrived in my role as an executive coach now.
I love it. What you say, because you brought that all your experience, all your training, and now I understand more how you went from the military to the corporate world was a logical transition at the time, and the true line of leadership, and how you brought it together now in your how you work with people as an executive and leadership coach. This is really great. And another thing that from previous conversations that I know that, and interesting enough, it's spoken a lot in leadership, and I know that originally comes from the military, is the concept of the VUCA world, the VUCA framework of being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That was a way of describing the conditions in modern warfare. So, how do you see this as something that is helpful in today's business environment?
Think about this, and this is how I think it got applied to the business environment. When you get in an airplane and go and take off, you really never know where you're going to land. You have a plan, right? But there are lots of things that can impact that plan. Aircraft are highly technical. Sometimes things don't work the way they're supposed to. The weather is a constant variable over which we have no control. Air traffic control, other aircraft. There may be some traffic, and air traffic control may take you off your route and tell you to do something that you hadn't planned on. And when you're talking about flying military aircraft, especially off of aircraft carriers in the Navy, now there's some other things. So you've got your airport, floating airport in the middle of the ocean, right? Things could go wrong with that, where it's like, hey, we can't land on the carrier for some reason. You're going to have to go somewhere else. All sorts of things happen that are well beyond your control. So we think about some of those things ahead of time. So those are all external threats, and they all apply to VUCA. So things can be volatile, especially if you're in combat situation where you're dealing with the enemy. People are shooting at you from other airplanes or from the ground. That's volatile. Uncertain. Again, I think we all need to get a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty, because there's uncertainty in everything. Like I mentioned before, the weather, how other people are going to react, things like that. Certain amount of ambiguity, because there may be some things of which you're unaware, especially in combat. Maybe the enemy have some capabilities that you didn't know of. And, complexity, again, everything gets to be complex. You have lots of people, lots of players, lots of variables, lots of moving parts. So in an aircraft, especially in military aircraft, we think about those things all the time. So what I found naturally that I was doing, and it took me a long time of reflection to realize this, I did some fractional COO work. And even before then, whenever I went into a company, I would start asking questions. I would start asking those what if questions. What if, our primary client just disappeared for whatever reason? What if we lost our top salesperson and they took their relationships with them? What if the state passed some law that made us unable to do something that we were able to do now? So there's lots of what ifs you could do, contingency planning and all of those things. But I think that was the biggest thing that I brought from aviation into the corporate world, was just considering all of those different things. And and it's not perfect, as the pandemic proved to all of us, you can't think of everything, because who would have thought of that? However, if you are prepared for some emergencies, at least you wouldn't be caught, just, frozen in the headlights, not knowing what to do.
And let me bring back the VUCA framework, because it's the traditional 4 quadrants that we so much use as a conceptual model in the business world. There is that dimension. We can consider that one of the dimensions is how well we can predict the results of our actions. And that the dimension is how much do we know about the situation. And both of the things we can get contingency plans. And that is one of the keys, because you really, from your background in the being preparing in the military and the navigation and the flying aircrafts is a lot about being prepared and the culture that you have of after every mission to debrief and to give feedback. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things that we do, every flight has 3 phases. You have a brief in which you talk about, this is what we're going to do. This is what our plan. You go out and execute the plan to the best of your ability. We just talked about things go wrong all the time. Hey, I have a perfect plan to go from point A to point B, but there's a thunderstorm between point A and point B, and air traffic control just vectored me around it, right? Again, you have to have all of that. Next is the debrief. So after you execute the flight, then you debrief and you talk about, okay, this is what we planned. This is how it went. What did we learn from it? What did we do that we shouldn't have done? What did we not do, that we should have done? All of these different things. And then we get feedback on our performance, especially if you're new in the role. You ask the pilot for a debrief on your performance. Hey, how'd I do? What did I miss? What could I have done better? And we all just get into that mindset of continuous improvement. So again, feedback, that brief, execute, debrief cycle made us, really come to crave the feedback. And if I could back up for a second, in the military, you go into a unit for a finite amount of time. While you're in that unit, as soon as you show up, you're being trained to replace someone. After a very short period of time, you are now training others to replace you. And so you've got that cycle. Nobody stays forever. So not like a corporate job where you could really have someone sit in the same job for 15 or 20 years. That doesn't happen in the military. So we're invested in making those folks that we are training the best that they could possibly be, because they are coming to replace you. Not only that, they're coming to fly alongside you. So if you're teaching someone to be a wingman, you want that person to be the best wingman that they could possibly be, because they're looking out for you, right? When you get to be the lead. And so there's that, you just want to get better. Everybody gets into this mindset of continuous improvement, and the feedback is the key to it. So I craved feedback, and I found when I first got out of the military, I just used to ask, so how'd that go? What did you think? Is there anything I could have done better? And I started asking those questions after we did events. And I found out, like frighteningly, that a lot of times people don't do that. They'll have a big project or something will happen and they don't take any time to talk about how it went. And so they end up sort of making the same mistakes over and over again.
So let's unpack this, because I think there is so much here to unpack and so much richness here. And I will argue that now in the corporate world, we cannot rely on that jobs that last forever either. But let's go just to, you do the briefing, execution, and the briefing. I think that is so simple and so powerful at the same time. So briefing is making sure that everybody knows the plan.
Yes.
And knows the contingencies if the things don't go according, the preparing. Then the execution, you have to be in your A game, because if you are flying a plane, there is not much room for error there. And afterwards, the debriefing and open to feedback. Did I got it correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
And these during training, like you're speaking, you go to a unit, you have to go over these, and it's a way of getting the training, a way of accelerate learning, and then you are training others and accelerating the learning from others. But my question is, even if in a situation, high stress situation of war zone, do they still keep the breathing execution, the breathing cycles?
Absolutely. That cycle is unbroken. It stays. And I'll give you an example, and you could probably look this up. The Blue Angels. I think everybody's seen the Blue Angels,
Yes.
The Navy's flight demonstration team. There are some videos out there about the Blue Angels debrief. And so let's think about this. The Blue Angels, let's say they're in the top, so let's say people who fly aircraft off of aircraft carriers are maybe in the top 1%, right? Let's say, not patting anybody on the back, but let's just make that assumption. Now, to become a Blue Angel, you have to take those folks that are in the top 1% and push them to the top 0.1%.
Wow.
Right? So there's always room for improvement. There is no place that you can be where there isn't room for improvement. So the same thing is for combat. So I think that watching a couple of those Blue Angel debrief videos to really see how they brief, they execute the flight and debrief, they may spend 3 hours on the debrief. They may have spent much more time on the debrief than they actually did on the flight. It's pretty amazing. But that is how you make folks better. That is concrete throughout aviation and doesn't get skipped.
I love it. And because they are in the Blue Angels, so they say all the details of the formation to keep it that level of exact precision. There is not room there for error
None,
again.
none.
Yes. And and the reason why I was wanting to ask you this directly is because in the business world, I hear a lot people from the startups, even for a bigger organization or corporation, oh, we don't have time for that. We are running and running. We don't have time for the feedback. We don't have time for the debriefing. And that is why it's so important to learn from the military that we create the time because it's important.
Sometimes I don't think you have time not to do it. I think everybody's heard the sort of slow down, the speed up kind of thing. If you really slow down and figure out what went wrong with this, what can we miss, it may help you to accelerate in the future. And I can give you an example where I worked for a company and we decided to they did a big project. And I'm making these numbers up, but we charged the client $15,000 for the project. Right. And we came back, and after too long, we were finally able to get everybody in the same room and really scrub and review that. Turns out it cost us $45,000 to do that project. So nobody can stay in business that way. So ultimately, it's like, hey, we don't have time to do this, but we were able to clearly identify where we did things wrong, what assumptions that we were making that was wrong, where we were undercharging. And we had continued to do that until we took the time to slow down. So you're going to keep making the same mistakes unless you make the time to slow down and really evaluate what you're doing.
And I love this because it's almost in the culture that you, in the military, that this is part of the culture. Feedback is welcome. And it's not the same culture in the corporation world. There is more resistance to feedback.
There is. Feedback is a 4-letter word, I think, in these days in corporate, which is unfortunate. But there are some people out there who are professionals in neuroscience and things like that can help us provide feedback in a more digestible manner for people. Because admittedly, in the military, you weren't necessarily concerned about people's feelings sometimes with the feedback. But then again, sometimes you have to make an impression. And I'm sure it happened to all of us where someone just yelled and screamed at you and made you feel bad for something that you did or a mistake that you made, but you remember it and will probably never make that mistake again. And so there's ways to do it, but there are some ways to deliver feedback in ways that makes everyone feel comfortable and psychologically safe.
And there is, okay, so how can business leaders create that culture where feedback isn't feared, but is welcomed?
That's a difficult question. And the thing that I would say is that if you move your culture more towards that collaboration, curiosity, and learning, it would help because we're all going to make mistakes. Right. And I think it's sort of how you make it right and what you learn from the mistake that matters. And if people really fear making mistakes, then that environment of psychological safety is not going to be there. So I think if you can approach everything from an environment of learning, I have, relationships with younger people. Just remember, I don't have kids of my own, so I sort of live my life through others. And, I did have a young man, run into some trouble. And I just said, what did you learn from that? And, he was somewhat taken aback by the question because he just expected me to criticize, the decision that he made. Just like, well, what'd you learn? And just like, okay, what would you do differently? Okay. Are you going to do that differently next time? Probably. Okay. So there are ways to do that the right way.
And
Maybe that's not the right way, but I think every individual has their methods.
again, let's unpack this because and this is the paradox. Sometimes we are running so fast or flying so fast that the room to mistakes is very little. And at the same time, mainly when we are speaking about corporations, yes, things are running fast, goals have to be met, and all of that. And at the same time, if there are not, I imagine that in military you'll be under training conditions, but in a company, if there is not that psychological safety for people to be able to express themselves, to put their best ideas on the table, even if they don't go anywhere. But otherwise, how do we have innovation if people are not experimenting with things?
I do believe, additionally, it has to start at the top, because if the executives don't buy into it, if the executives don't get along, if the leadership team doesn't believe that, then that's going to permeate throughout the organization. A CEO that I work with some years ago told me something that I wouldn't forget. And he said, that I haven't forgotten. And he said, attitude has momentum. And it truly does. And so that's good and bad, right? So if those values are being lived and exemplified from the top, it flows throughout the organization. Easier said than done, admittedly, but you have to start somewhere. You have to have executive champions, and the leadership team has to be living that
So,
first.
in many ways, we can start in the C-suite with this culture of briefing, execution, and the briefing and the feedback at that level of the leadership teams, and then cascade that down the organization.
I believe so.
And one thing that you are doing now a lot, I see you a lot writing on LinkedIn, and you have these things that you call, I think, leadership lessons from aviation. Tell us a little, an example of one of these lessons, and how does this resonate with people on LinkedIn?
Again, it's a series of posts called Leadership Lessons from Aviation. I try to make it not too long. I try to make it a little bit simple and with sort of a format of 3 things that you can learn from it. And I use all sorts of different examples. One of the ones just recently, I think it was either last week or the week before, talked about delegation. And it talked about adopting the mindset of a co-pilot. And that means, what is the co-pilot mindset? And what that talks about is pilots rely on the co-pilots for safety, clear role. The co-pilot has specific responsibilities. The pilot has specific responsibilities, but they're also backing each other up, right? There's open communication between the two and trust. You have to be able to trust those folks. And so, you know, the team, so that responsibility is shared throughout the team. So now translating all that to leadership is empowering your team to take ownership of their specific role. Pilots, you have to give up something. You can't be control of everything, right? So you do have to delegate some responsibility, but you have to figure out the right responsibilities to delegate, right? And trust isn't necessarily a nice to have. There has to be trust between the two. Now, in the military and in aviation, that inherent trust is the fact that you've earned those wings because you know what that person has gone through to get those wings and to earn that designation. And so and then there's some things about pilots, military officers that are just inherent trust because you know what that person's been through. And the other thing about the whole delegation thing, again, lots of interaction about that, is that it allows the entire team to share in coming up with the right solution when there's pressure, when things don't go according to plan. Because one of the things we do is, I tell you, we go and plan the flight, but there are a lot of times where it doesn't go to plan. And so you have to be ready when things don't go according to plan. I ask people, say, how comfortable are you letting go? How comfortable are you delegating? And that seemed to, again, get a lot of interest from people.
Love it. And all this complexity and all the lessons that we can learn, the importance of trust, the importance of the feedback, all that is there.
Yes.
Love it. So where can people go and learn more about you and your work?
As you mentioned, LinkedIn. I like LinkedIn. It's my favorite channel. I try to post on LinkedIn often. You can find me there. Send me a message on LinkedIn. Send me a direct message, or just reach out and engage with one of the posts. I have a website, www.wolfmanagementsolutions.com, and an email, ron@wolfmanagementsolutions.com. But the fastest you'll probably get actually is email, but LinkedIn is what I prefer because it allows us automatically to learn a little bit about each other. And again, as you mentioned, I specialize in working with engineers now. So if there are any engineers out there that are saying to themselves, man, I just want to go back to being an engineer, an engineer in a leadership role. So if you're in a leadership role as a technical person or an engineer, and you're just looking around going, what did I just do to myself? Or can I just go back to being an engineer? Those are the folks that I really enjoy working with. So
Love it.
reach out, please.
And they can connect with you on LinkedIn, and I will make sure that I put all that information in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Expanding possibilities, the mindset zone.
If you can think of a person who will find this episode helpful, please share it. Spreading the word about the Mindset Zone podcast is very powerful. For extra resources, including information about the book and audiobook, Mindset Zone, Actualize Your Human Potential, go to mindset.zone. Yes, instead of .com is .zone. As always, I'm so grateful that you are here. Expand what's possible for you, for the ones around you, for the world.